The cats knew before she did. Tibbles had been at the window since 7:30, his tail moving in that slow, deliberate way that in Kneazle-touched creatures meant something was approaching, or thinking about approaching, or considering approaching from a direction it hadn't decided on yet. Arabella Figg had long since learned to trust the cat's sense of anticipation over her own. She stood at the kitchen window with her tea going cold in her hands, and watched Tibbles watch the street, and thought, without particularly wanting to think it, that today was the 31st of July. She had been on Wisteria Walk for 6 months. 6 months of cabbage soup and cat hair, and the particular loneliness of watching a street where nothing happened and being required to keep watching it anyway. Dumbledore had not given her a schedule. He had given her an address. 4 Privet Drive, 2 streets over, a tidy semi-detached she could not see from her window, but could reach in 4 minutes on foot, and an instruction, which was that she was to watch Harry Potter, and a secondary instruction, which was not to tell the boy anything about what she was, or what he was, or what any of it meant. She had accepted all 3. She had asked once what she was supposed to do if something happened, and Dumbledore had looked at her with those half-moon spectacles and that expression of weary benevolence, and said that he trusted her judgment, and she had understood from this that he trusted her to do nothing. Snowy came off the windowsill and wound around her ankles. Mr. Paws was asleep on the chair by the radiator. Tufty, who was the strangest of the 4 and the one most inclined to moods, had arranged herself at the foot of the stairs and was staring up them at nothing visible, which was either a cat thing or a Kneazle thing, or simply a Tufty thing, and Arabella had long since stopped trying to distinguish between the 3. The house smelled of cabbage. It always smelled of cabbage. She had, after considerable reflection, decided this was useful. The knock came at 9:30. She set down her tea and smoothed her cardigan and went to the door, and there was Petunia Dursley, with a child's hand held loosely in her own, and an expression that communicated, with considerable efficiency, that she was doing Arabella a favor by appearing here at all. Petunia was a tall, thin woman with a long neck and pale eyes that moved quickly and noticed everything, and trusted almost nothing of what they found. The child standing beside her was her opposite in almost every particular, small where she was angular, still where she was composed, with a great deal of untidy black hair that stuck up in several directions at once, and eyes of an extraordinary green that looked up at Arabella from the doorstep with neither wariness. Measuring quiet. He was 2 years old. He looked like someone who had already decided that patience was probably safer than asking. "He needs to be back by 4, Petunia said, and pressed a folded slip of paper into Arabella's hand. Then she turned and went back down the path without looking back, as though she had completed a transaction rather than left a child. Arabella looked at the note. It confirmed the 4 o'clock collection time and listed what Harry was allowed to eat, which was 2 things, both unremarkable. It did not mention that today was his birthday. She looked at the child. He was looking at her with a calm, patient attention, still holding the hand that was no longer holding his. "Well," she said to him, because something had to be said. "Come in, then." He came in. He did not grab the doorframe or hang back, or ask where he was going, or what her name was, or any of the other things that 2-year-olds generally required answering. He walked into her front room with the unhurried care of a child who had learned to take up as little space as possible, stopped in the middle of the floor, and looked at the photographs on the wall. There were a great many photographs on the wall. Arabella had 4 cats, and had been photographing them for the better part of a decade, and the result was that every available surface above a certain height was occupied by images of Tibbles and Snowy and Mr. C. Paws and Tufty, in various states of repose, alertness, and dignified irritation. Most people, encountering this room for the first time, said something. The ones who did not say something usually had an expression. Harry Potter said nothing. He looked at the photographs with the attentive, unhurried interest of a very small person who had found something that warranted looking at. Tufty emerged from behind the sofa and put her nose against his knee. He looked down at her without startling. He extended one hand, fingers curled inward, and let her smell it first, the way you let things come to you before you tried to meet them. Arabella watched this and said nothing. She had a great many things she was not supposed to say, and had become, over 6 months, practiced at not saying them. The morning passed the way mornings do when you are managing a very quiet child in a house that smells of cabbage. Slowly, and with a good deal of cat, she did not offer him treats. She did not make the visit pleasant in any way she could not account for, if the Dursleys asked. She sat in her chair and watched him watch the cats, and the cats watched him back with the frank and slightly possessive attention of animals sharing their personal space on provisional terms, and nobody spoke very much. He looked at the photographs on the wall for a long time. He sat on the floor when his legs got tired. He let Mr. Paws sniff his hair and bore this with equanimity. He was thin, was the thing she kept returning to in the spaces between thoughts about other things. He was thin in a way that had nothing to do with being 2 years old, and everything to do with things she was not supposed to examine too closely. He moved with the conserved stillness of a child who had, at some recent point, arrived at the conclusion that stillness was less likely to cause trouble than noise. She was building a very uncomfortable picture of his daily life, and she was not allowed to do anything about it. At some point in the early afternoon he settled onto the floor in the long stripe of light that came through the south-facing window. The light came in at an angle and lay warm across the floorboards, and he sat in it with Mr. Paws on one side and Tufty nosing at his elbow, and the three of them looked, in the amber of it, like something that deserved to be kept. Arabella looked at her camera on the shelf. It was a perfectly ordinary camera. She had bought it years ago because Tibbles had been doing something unusually photogenic on the garden wall, and since then she had used it for all the small performances the cats put on without knowing they were performing. She knew how to use it. It was loaded with ordinary film from the chemist's because she was a squib, had been a squib her whole life, had grown up with magic all around her, and none of it in her had learned to do things with her hands that other people did with wands, and ordinary film from the chemist's was what she had to work with. The camera was a tool. It lived on the shelf. She used it for the cats. She was not doing anything unusual. She picked it up. He did not notice he was watching Mr. Paws put one large paw onto his knee with an expression of concentrated interest, as though this were a development of some significance. Tufty had resettled against his side. He was very still, the way children are still, when something they like has come close and they do not want to frighten it off. She raised the camera. She pressed the shutter. The flash went off. He blinked. He did not startle, did not flinch, did not produce any of the sounds that might reasonably be expected from a 2-year-old confronted with sudden light. He simply blinked, once with the equanimity of someone who had decided that reacting sharply to things was generally not worth the effort, and then looked back at Mr. Paws. Arabella lowered the camera. She stood in the middle of her front room and looked at the child sitting in the afternoon light with 2 cats beside him and thought very clearly that she would not be doing this again. At 4 o'clock, Petunia Dursley came back. She rang the bell once, and Harry stood up and went to the door, without being called, as though he had been listening for it the whole time. He did not look back into the room. The door closed, and the house was quiet in the particular way. Houses are quiet when they have recently contained a child, and no longer do. She developed the photograph in the cupboard under the stairs that she had converted into a darkroom, which she found too ironic to think about for long. She stood with her hands in the developer and watched the image appear. Harry James Potter, age 2, thin, sitting in afternoon light with 2 cats on either side of him. The cats were looking directly at the camera because cats did that. He was looking slightly to one side, at something to his left, or at nothing in particular. The interior, self-contained expression of a very small person thinking thoughts he had not learned to share with anyone yet. She put the photograph in an envelope. She did not write anything on the envelope. She put it in the box she kept in the kitchen cupboard behind the cat food tins, and she told herself with some conviction that this was not something she would do again. She told herself this standing in the kitchen in the quiet of the house, with Tibbles at the window and Snowy on the sill, and Mr. Paws back in his chair by the radiator, and Tufty at the foot of the stairs staring at nothing. The cabbage smell settled around her like a fact. 2 streets over, in the tidy semi-detached she could reach in 4 minutes, a boy who did not know what he was had gone back to the people who knew and had decided not to tell him. She fed the cats, she washed her cup, she left the box where it was, behind the cat food tins, and she did not take it out again. Not until the following July. She had told herself no. She had told herself no, with some thoroughness over the course of the year, in October, when she had looked at the box on the shelf, and then deliberately not taken it down, in January, when she had walked past the darkroom cupboard and kept walking, in April, when she had stood in the chemist's and looked at the film and bought it anyway for the cats. She had told herself, because the light in the garden was good in spring, and Snowy had been doing something unusually decorative in the hydrangeas. The film had sat in the camera since April. The camera had sat on the shelf. She had taken it down this morning to photograph Mr. Paws, who was asleep in the window, with his chin on the sill in a way that she would almost certainly never see again. She had not photographed Mr. Paws. She had put the camera on the table beside her tea. She was not doing anything unusual. The box was still in the kitchen cupboard behind the cat food tins. The envelope was still in the box. She had not opened it since the night she put it there. Harry Potter arrived at 9:30, as he had the year before. He was 3 years old now, and the difference between 2 and 3 was more than Arabella had expected. He had language, for one thing. Not in the way that some children had language, as a mechanism for continuous narration or insistent requests, but in a more deliberate way, as though he had been issued a limited supply and had made careful decisions about how to spend it. He walked without wobbling. He was still small in the way she had noticed last year, and noticed again now with the same uncomfortable specificity, and he was wearing a jumper that must have belonged to someone considerably larger, its sleeves turned up at the wrists multiple times to reveal a thin brown forearm. Petunia delivered him the same way she had before, efficiently, at pace with a note about the 4 o'clock collection. She did not mention that it was his birthday. She turned and went back down the path. The door closed. He looked up at Arabella. "Tibbles," he said, which was not a question. He had caught sight past her hip of the large tabby cat who had materialized at the end of the hall. "That's right," Arabella said. He nodded, as though she had confirmed something he had not seriously doubted, and went inside. He went directly to the front room. He went directly to the wall of photographs. This was what stopped her, the directness of it, the complete absence of the scanning pause that a child entering an unfamiliar room usually made. He did not look around to establish where he was. He knew where he was. He had been here before, 1 year ago, and he had retained it. He stood in front of the photographs and worked his way along the wall with the methodical patience of someone completing a task they have been saving. He named them, as he went quietly to himself, rather than to her. Snowy at the pale cat with the amber eyes, Mr. Paws at the large grey one, though he said it in 2 careful syllables, Mr. as though the formality was important, Tufty. At the narrow tortoiseshell caught mid-leap in a photograph from 4 years ago. He had remembered. He had been here for 1 day, 1 year ago, and he had remembered all 4 of them by name. Arabella stood in the doorway and looked at the back of his head, at the extraordinary disorder of his black hair, and felt something she could not immediately name settle across the morning like weather coming in. She had the camera in her hand. She had picked it up, she thought, on the way out of the kitchen, though she could not precisely account for the decision. She raised it. He was still looking at the photographs, still moving along the wall with his slow, attentive inventory. He reached the last cluster, the photographs from 2 Christmases ago, Tibbles and Tufty sitting together in a square of winter light, and began to turn back toward the start, and in turning he said Tibbles again, confirming the circuit, and looked up. "Wha?" The flash caught him full in the face. He flinched. It was the first time she had seen him flinch at anything. A small, involuntary movement, head going back half an inch, eyes squeezing shut, and then he opened them again and stood there blinking, and the green of them in the aftermath of the flash was extraordinary, the kind of green that shouldn't exist in eyes, the green of deep water or old glass. "Sorry," Arabella said, because she was. He considered her for a moment with those blinking, light-dazzled eyes. Then he turned back to the photographs. She lowered the camera. She was aware that she had not meant to photograph him at that precise moment, and that the photograph she had taken would be better than anything she had intended. She was aware that this awareness was not a comfortable thing to be having. The rest of the morning proceeded as these mornings did. She sat in her chair. He sat on the floor. The cats came and went around him, with the judicious casualness of cats who had made a provisional decision about someone, and were not yet ready to announce it publicly. He did not speak much, and when he did speak, it was the spare, considered speech of someone who had already learned that words, like most things, were not given out in unlimited quantities. He asked at some point whether Tufty was the one who had sat beside him last time. Arabella said yes, though she was not certain this was true and suspected he was testing her. He accepted the answer and did not pursue it. At 4 o'clock, Petunia came back. He went to the door. Afterward, Arabella went to the kitchen and took the box out from behind the cat food tins, and the envelope out from the box, and the photograph out from the envelope. She held it in both hands. Harry James Potter, age 2. Thin, in afternoon light. 2 cats on either side of him, looking at the camera with that open, unself-conscious attention that cats brought to everything. He was looking slightly away at something she couldn't see, or at nothing at all. She set the photograph on the kitchen table and went back to the darkroom cupboard and developed the new film while the kettle boiled. When the image came up, she stood and looked at it for some time. Harry James Potter, age 3. Looking directly at the camera because the flash had forced him to his eyes wide and catching the light green in the sharp, overexposed way that flash photography did to color. His mouth was partly open around the syllable he'd been forming when the shutter caught him. His hair, in the bright light, was impossibly black. He was in the jumper with the turned-up sleeves, and one hand was raised toward the photographs on the wall, index finger extended, in the middle of pointing at Tibbles. She brought the 2 photographs to the kitchen table and set them side by side, the same child, 1 year apart. She looked at them for a long time, trying to find the word for what she was observing. He had grown in the purely technical sense. He was taller in the second photograph than in the first. She could see it in the proportion of him to the wall, to the photos in the frame behind him. He was measurably bigger. And yet the word her mind kept reaching for, looking at the two photographs together, was smaller. Not smaller in the physical sense. Smaller in some other sense she couldn't quite name, some sense that had to do with how he held himself, with what he expected from rooms and from people in them. He had been in one house for a year, and he had grown in height and contracted in expectation, and she did not know what to call that. Children grew. She knew that she had known plenty of children. They grew and they grew and they filled rooms with themselves, with noise and demands and the particular gravitational pull that children had. And she sat here in her house that smelled of cabbage, and she watched one grow inward instead of out. She slid both photographs into the envelope. She put the envelope back in the box. She put the box behind the cat food tins. She went and watered her plants. She did it without thinking about it, the way you water plants mechanically, moving through the kitchen and the front room with the watering can, checking the soil of each pot without really seeing it. Tufty followed her, and then stopped following her, and sat down in the hall, and watched her with an expression that had judgment in it somewhere. Arabella set the watering can down. She looked at the kitchen cupboard where the box was. She thought about the word smaller. She thought, and was not entirely sure why she was thinking it, that someone should be keeping track of this, that someone should be writing it down or saying it out loud, or at the very minimum acknowledging that a small child was arriving at this house every year in clothes that were not his own, and leaving the same way, and that in between those arrivals he was growing, technically, while in some other and more essential way he was doing the opposite. She was the only one watching. That was the thing. Whatever she failed to notice, nobody else was positioned to catch. She did not take the box back out. She filled the kettle instead, and put it on, and stood at the window while it came to the boil, and watched Snowy make her slow circuit of the garden wall in the last of the afternoon light. She noticed it when he took off his jacket. It was a warm morning for July, and Arabella had been about to tell him he could leave the jacket on the peg by the door, but he had already shrugged it off himself and hung it at a child's height on the lowest peg, with the neatness of someone who had learned to put things away, precisely because things left out had consequences. He turned around, and there it was on his left forearm, a bruise, yellowing at the edges, which meant it was several days old, sitting on the thin skin over the bone, with the specific settled quality of something that had been there long enough to stop hurting. He was 4 years old. He did not mention it. He did not look at it or adjust his sleeve to cover it. He did not look at her to see if she had noticed. He walked past her into the front room and said, "Morning, Tibbles," in his quiet, deliberate way to the cat, who had materialized in the hall. And that was that. Arabella stood by the peg and looked at the jacket and thought about what she was supposed to do. She knew what she was supposed to do. She was supposed to do what she had been doing for 2 years. Record nothing she was not authorized to record, tell no one anything she was not authorized to tell. She was supposed to notice things and keep the noticing to herself, because the arrangement she was part of had been designed to keep Harry Potter alive and safe and ignorant in that order. And the people running the arrangement had decided that those 3 things were compatible, and she was not in a position to argue otherwise. She went to the kitchen and wetted a flannel. He was standing in the front room with Tufty winding around his legs when she came back. She knelt down in front of him, which put her at his height, and took his arm gently by the wrist, and pressed the cool flannel to the bruise. He let her. He stood very still, and let her, the way he stood still for everything, not with resistance, not with welcome, but with a patient, neutral waiting, as though he had learned that other people sometimes did things to him, and the most efficient response was to remain uninvolved until it was over. She cleaned around it. She did not ask how he had gotten it. She could have asked. She had teeth and a voice and perfectly functional language, and she could have asked, very simply, "What happened to your arm?" And he would have answered her in his careful, rationed way, and she would have known. She did not ask. She cleaned the edges of the bruise with the flannel, and she hated herself, in a quiet, competent way for not asking, and she pressed the flannel against the discoloration one more time, and then stood up and went to put the flannel in the sink. The Dursleys were not harming him. She told herself this. She told herself this the way you tell yourself things you need to stay functional, not because you believe them completely, but because the alternative to believing them is a door she was not authorized to open. The bruise was old, and healing children fell. Children ran into things. Children were 4 years old and lived in houses with coffee tables and door frames and flights of stairs, and this produced bruises. She knew what she was looking for. She had been looking for it for 3 years. She had not yet seen the specific type of bruise or the specific pattern of injury that would force her hand, and she did not know whether to be relieved or more frightened by the fact that she was looking for a threshold rather than responding to what she could already see. She made tea she did not particularly want and brought it to the front room and sat in her chair, and Harry sat on the floor with Mr. Paws draped across his feet, and the morning proceeded. He was talking more at 4 than he had at 3. Not more freely, not with more trust, but more practically, in the way that language becomes a useful tool once you've had enough of it to use it as one. He told her at some point that Mr. Paws was fat. This was true. Mr. Paws had been fat for years and bore this observation with dignity. She told him Paws was big-boned, which she had been telling herself for approximately the same amount of time. Harry considered this with a slight frown that suggested he found it unconvincing, but was prepared to let it pass. It happened in the late morning, while she was in the kitchen doing nothing in particular. She heard one of the cats, Snowy by the sound of it, who had strong feelings about certain things, make the sharp, startled noise that cats made when something surprised them. And then, from the front room, there was the very particular sound of something being set down that had not been set down by anyone. She was in the doorway, within a breath. The cup she had left on the coffee table when she brought the tea through. Her own cup, the blue one, sitting on the table at some distance from where Harry was seated on the floor, was no longer on the far end of the table. It was on the near end, the end closest to Harry, where it most certainly had not been. Harry was looking at Snowy, who had recovered her composure and was washing her paw on the windowsill as though nothing had happened. The cup sat where it sat. Nobody had touched it. Harry had not noticed. He was watching Snowy with his usual calm attention. He had not registered the movement, or if he had processed it the way children sometimes processed impossible things, by simply not finding it remarkable. Arabella stood in the doorway. She had grown up in a house where magic was as common as bread. She had a brother who could transfigure a spoon to a pen between bites of breakfast. She had a mother who had not used a mop in her life. She had sat at tables with wands, propped against bowls of cereal, and had felt, for the entirety of her childhood and most of her adult life, the particular texture of being the only person in a room who could not do what everyone around her could do. She knew what accidental magic looked like. She knew what it felt like when it had happened in a room, the way you could feel the air differently for a moment after, slightly changed, like the smell after lightning. She could not say anything. She was not allowed to tell him that the cup had moved because of him, that he was the reason things sometimes did what he needed them to do before he'd worked out how to ask, that he was this small, thin, bruised 4-year-old who had learned to take up very little space in rooms. She could not tell him any of that. Dumbledore had decided when he was old enough to understand, and old enough was not 4, and it was not her decision to make. The cup sat on the near end of the table. She gave him a biscuit at midday. She told herself he needed to eat, that whatever he was getting at home was not what it should be, and that a biscuit was not giving him anything that could be construed as enjoyment by the Dursleys. This was true, and was also not the whole truth. She put it on a plate and brought it to him, and he took it and said, "Thank you," in his formal, careful way, and ate it with an attention that suggested it had been some time since he'd eaten something without worrying about whether he was allowed to. She photographed him eating it. He was not looking at the camera. He was looking at the biscuit in his hand with his complete, serious attention, this child who brought his complete and serious attention to everything, as though the world kept offering him things that required careful examination. She pressed the shutter. He did not look up. At 4 o'clock, Petunia came. He put on his jacket. He went. That evening, after the cats had been fed and the house had gone dark around her, Arabella took the box out from behind the cat food tins and the envelope out from the box. She slid the newly developed photograph out beside the other 2 and set all 3 on the kitchen table and looked at them in the lamplight. 3 photographs. 3 years. She had been calling it, in the privacy of her own mind, the record, as though it were an administrative document, as though she had found in the word record a container large enough to hold what she was doing without admitting what she was doing. She looked at the photographs, at the small child in afternoon light, who was not looking at the camera, who was never quite looking at the camera, who was always looking at something just to one side of her, as though whatever was directly in front of him was less interesting than something slightly elsewhere. She looked at the bruise she had not photographed, because she had not thought to, and then at the 3rd photograph, the biscuit, his thin hands around it, a record of what? The answer formed slowly, the way the image had formed in the developer, emerging out of nothing, becoming itself gradually, too late to stop her. A record of a child being here in this house, alive and present and seen by her and no one else. On the days when being seen was the least of what he should have been given and the most of what she had to offer, she put the photographs away and did not take them back out. 5 weeks earlier she had watched Harry arrive at her door on Dudley's birthday, with a particular quality of quiet about him. Not his usual quiet, which was the quiet of someone who had learned economy, but a newer, tighter quiet, the kind that meant something had happened recently and been filed away. She had not asked about it then. She had given him lunch and let him sit with the cats and returned him at 4 o'clock, and it was only later, when she was feeding Tibbles and thinking about something else entirely, that she understood what she had seen in him that June afternoon, the look of someone who has received an accurate piece of information about how much they matter and is still in the process of deciding what to do with it. She had not known in June what the information was. She knew now. He told her about it 20 minutes after arriving on the morning of the 31st of July, standing in front of the photographs on the wall with his back half turned to her, and his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone reporting facts rather than feelings. Dudley got a robot for his birthday, he said. He was looking at the photograph of Snowy on the mantelpiece, or appearing to. It walks and talks, does it? Arabella said. It has buttons on its chest. A pause. He moved along the wall to the next photograph. I got dog biscuits. He said it the way he said everything, flatly as information, the way you might say the weather was likely to turn or the bus was running late. He did not look at her to see how she received it. He was 5 years old, and he was stating the arithmetic of his life with the fluency of someone who had been doing the sums for long enough that the results no longer surprised him. Arabella looked at the back of his head, at the black hair going in every direction at once, at the collar of his shirt, a striped thing, far too large, the kind of collar designed for a much broader set of shoulders, sitting somewhere around his shoulder blades rather than his neck. She said, "Come and have some biscuits." This was a ridiculous thing to say. She was aware of its ridiculousness. She was aware of the particular absurdity of standing in a house that smelled of cabbage and offering plain biscuits from a tin to a child who had, 5 weeks ago, been given dog biscuits, while his cousin received a robot that walked and talked. She could not offer him the robot. She could not offer him a birthday party, or parents who saw him when they looked at him, or any of the several thousand things that would actually address what she had just been told. She could offer him biscuits from a tin, and tea he probably wouldn't drink, and the company of 4 pot-neasel cats who had decided to tolerate him. She put the biscuits on a plate and brought them to the front room. He ate 2 of them with the same focused attention he brought to biscuits every year, as though biscuits were a thing that required concentration, and then Tufty came and put her nose against his ankle, and he reached down and scratched between her ears with one thin hand. "Does the robot have a name?" Arabella asked, because she found she could not sit in silence with what she now knew. He thought about this. "Dudley calls it Robert," he said. "Because it's a robot." She looked at him. Something in her chest did something uncomfortable. "That's very logical," she said. He nodded seriously, as though she had made a reasonable point. She wanted to say, "I know what you are worth, and they do not." She wanted to say it clearly, wanted to say that a child who at 5 years old could identify logical naming conventions and state a social injustice with perfect composure and sit in someone else's house for a whole morning without once demanding that the morning be about him was worth considerably more than the household making him sleep in a cupboard. Giving him dog biscuits on his cousin's birthday. She did not say any of it. She was not permitted to bridge the distance Dumbledore had built between Harry Potter and anyone who might tell him the truth about himself, and she had known this when she took the posting, and had agreed to it. And on most days, she agreed with the logic of it. This was not one of those days. He drifted, later in the morning, to the window that looked on to the back garden. It was a good garden in July. Arabella kept it well, grew things in it, and the summer had been warm enough that things were doing what they were supposed to do. He stood at the window with his hands by his sides and looked out at it, and she could see from across the room what he was seeing. The runner beans climbing their canes, the roses doing their slow, extravagant collapse in the heat, Snowy crossing the garden wall with her tail up in the way that suggested the garden next door had produced something worth investigating. She picked up the camera. She had stopped arguing with herself about the camera. She had stopped somewhere between March and June of this year, having the conversation with herself where one part of her said she would not do it again, and the other part pointed out, with quiet precision, that she clearly was going to, and that perhaps they could agree on this and move on. She had not taken a photograph on Dudley's birthday in June, because something about photographing him in the immediate aftermath of the dog biscuits had felt wrong in a way she couldn't articulate. But today was his birthday, and she had the camera in her hand, and he was standing at her window looking at her garden. He did not hear her raise it. He was watching Snowy on the wall, or watching the beans, or watching nothing. She couldn't see his face. She took the photograph, his back to the camera. The black hair, impossible and extraordinary. the thin neck rising from a collar that was meant for someone else. The particular angle of his shoulders, which were not a child's shoulders in the way that suggested comfort, they were the shoulders of a child who had learned to carry the weight of being where he was, in rooms he was permitted to inhabit only provisionally at someone else's convenience. She could see his hands hanging at his sides, relaxed and still. He did not turn around. That evening, she wrote the letter. She had been composing it in her head since the previous year, since the bruise on his forearm, since the cup that had slid across the table, in June of the year before that. She had been running it through her mind at odd moments, feeding the cats, lying awake at 3 a.m, watching the street in November when there was nothing on the street and nothing to watch. And she had been telling herself each time that she would send it when she had something conclusive. And she understood now that conclusive was not a threshold she was ever going to reach. She would always be one step back from conclusive. She would always be almost but not quite certain enough. She would write the letter now, and she would put it away, and eventually she would send it. She wrote it by hand at the kitchen table, with Tibbles on the chair beside her. She wrote about his thinness, which was not the thinness of a healthy child. She wrote about the clothes, which were the clothes of a larger child who had no further use for them. She wrote about the bruise she had cleaned from his forearm the previous year, which she had not asked about, and now wished she had. She wrote about what he had said this morning, about the robot, about the dog biscuits, in the same flat, factual tone in which he had said it. She wrote it all down efficiently, because she was not by nature an intemperate person, and because fury required some management if it was going to be of any use. She did not mention the photographs. She read the letter back and recognized that mentioning the photographs would require explaining the photographs, and explaining the photographs would change what the letter was, and she was not ready to change what the letter was. She sealed it. She did not address it. She put it in the drawer under the writing table, behind the utility bills and the cat's vaccination records, and she told herself she would know when to send it. Later she took out the box and looked at all 4 photographs on the table, ages 2, 3, 4, 5. She had been thinking of what she was doing as documenting growth. She had been thinking of the photographs as a record of change, and now she looked at them in sequence and understood that what she was documenting was not growth, but something closer to its opposite. He was taller in each photograph. She could see it, a fraction more of him each year, against the constant background of her walls and her floors and her furniture. He was technically, measurably bigger, and in every other way she could observe, he was exactly the same, as quiet, as contained, as carefully present, as unused to being the subject of anything, anyone's attention, anyone's care, anyone's particular recognition of his particular existence. He had remained himself with a thoroughness she was beginning to find alarming. Neglect should not have produced this. Neglect usually produced something noisier, something more ragged. What she was watching instead was a child who had arranged himself around an absence, until the absence had become structural, until the shape he held himself in assumed and accommodated and did not resist what he was not being given. She gathered the photographs together and put them back in the box. Outside, the July evening was doing the slow, reluctant things that July evenings did. The cats arranged themselves for the night. The house smelled of cabbage and cut grass, and from the window she had left open the faint sweetness of the roses, finally too warm to hold themselves upright. Arabella sat at the kitchen table with her hands folded and thought about the letter in the drawer, about the 4 photographs in the box, about a 5-year-old who had told her about dog biscuits the way you told someone the time. She thought about what it meant to be the only person writing this down. He had been in school for a year, which meant he had been in a room with other children for long enough to notice what other children had. He arrived at 9:30, as he always did, handed over by Petunia with the efficiency that characterized all their exchanges, and he stood in the hall for a moment and looked at the house with the look of someone returning to a place they have been before and are still deciding how to feel about. He was 6. He had grown in the way children grew, when they grew reluctantly, a little taller, a little more himself, more language and more stillness at once, which should have been contradictory, and in him was not. He said hello to Tibbles, who was in the hall because Tibbles was always in the hall, and then he went into the front room and stood before the photographs. He was quieter than usual this year, not the specific, tighter quiet of the dog biscuit summer. This was something else, something more like a question that hadn't found the right moment yet. She let him stand at the photographs for longer than she normally did. She sat in her chair with her tea and let him take his time, and he went along the walls slowly, the way he had been doing since he was 3, naming the ones he recognized to himself in a voice just under the threshold of being meant for her. "Tibbles," he said, "Snowy, Mr. Paws, Tufty." He said them slowly, the 4 living cats' names, with the deliberateness of someone wanting the words to settle properly, wanting to keep them the way you wanted to keep something you were not sure you would be allowed to keep. He said them again when he reached the end of the wall, not because he'd lost his place, because the saying of them did something that one saying didn't quite complete. She watched him and thought, he's done this every year since he was 3. He always comes back to those 4 names, those 4 particular names. She had not noticed until this moment how much care he put into the returning. He came and sat on the floor in front of her chair, with his knees pulled up. "Did my parents ever give me a birthday party?" he asked. He asked it in the way he asked things he had been considering for some time, directly, without warning, folded into a gap in the silence, as though it had always belonged there. He was not looking at her when he asked. Paws, who had come to investigate the possibility of company, and was now sitting at a middle distance assessing. "I don't know," Arabella told him. He received this. She watched him receive it, not with disappointment exactly, which would have required more expectation than he appeared to have, something more like the filing of a confirmation. "I don't know" was at least not a no, and he was 6 years old and had learned to be precise about what he was, and wasn't being told. "Didn't you know them?" he asked. Not really. This was true. She had been assigned to Wisteria Walk by Dumbledore, assigned to Harry, to the proximity of Harry, to the watching of Harry, and his parents had been dead by then, and she had not known them personally in the years they were alive. She had known of them. She had known what most people in the Order knew, which was that James and Lily Potter had been extraordinary and brave and were now gone, and that what they had left behind was this small, quiet, careful boy who stood at her photographs every July and said the cats' names twice to make sure they stayed. She had known all of that, and none of it was hers to give him. "I knew who they were," she said, "but I didn't know them." He nodded slowly, still looking at Mr. Paws. He had at 6 the habit of processing things with his whole body rather than just his face, a slight adjustment of posture, a settling as though he were rearranging himself around whatever he'd just been given to hold. "Jamie Hutchins had a party," he said after a moment, "in June, with a cake. There were balloons." She looked at him. "Was it a good party?" He thought about this seriously. He had a magician, he said. "I wasn't invited." She could not say anything that would be of any use, so she did not say anything. She got up and refreshed her tea and stood in the kitchen for a moment longer than was necessary, and when she came back, she sat down and said, "Do you want to hold Tufty?" She had told herself on the way from the kitchen back to the front room that this was an observational exercise. She could observe, for the purposes of her ongoing monitoring of Harry Potter, how a child interacted with an animal. This was a reasonable and defensible observational activity. She was aware, as she said it, that this was not the actual reason she was asking. The actual reason was standing in front of her in a jumper with the sleeves pushed up, 6 years old, and not invited to Jamie Hutchins's party in June, and she did not have a cake or balloons or a magician to offer him, and Tufty was nearby. Tufty was, of the 4 cats, the most particular about who she consented to. She had a narrow catalogue of approved persons and was not easily swayed. She had been observing Harry for 4 years now, and she made her decision in the way Kneazle-touched cats made decisions, suddenly, comprehensively, without apparent deliberation. She came over from the windowsill when Arabella called her, walked directly to Harry, with the air of a creature who had settled something, and arranged herself in his lap, with the authority of a cat claiming a position she had always considered rightfully hers. Harry went very still. He held her the way you held something you had been unexpectedly given, with both hands, with a care so precise it looked like concentration. His hands were thin and his fingers were careful, and he did not clutch or squeeze the way some children did. He held Tufty the way you held something you had learned, through specific experience, could be removed, with complete attention and zero assumption of permanence. Arabella watched him. She picked up the camera. He heard it this time, the small preparatory sounds of her adjusting her hold, and he looked up. Not startled, the way he had been at 3. Not with the alert attention of someone registering an interruption. He looked up in the easy, incidental way that people look up when something familiar happens in a familiar room. He had been here 6 times on his birthday, and the camera was part of what this house contained. Like the cat photographs, and the cabbage smell, and the certain quality of afternoon light through the south window, he had acclimated to it without anyone asking him to. He simply looked up, holding Tufty, and there was nothing in his face except the quiet expectancy of someone waiting for a thing that has happened before to happen again. She pressed the shutter. The photograph, when she developed it that evening, showed him looking slightly to the right of the lens rather than directly into it. The camera was a familiar thing, not an interesting thing, and his eyes had drifted almost immediately back to Tufty. Tufty was looking directly into the camera, with the unambiguous self-possession of a cat who had no concerns about documentation. She put the photograph on the kitchen table alongside the others, 5 of them now. She laid them out in order, age 2, age 3, age 4, age 5, age 6, and stood over them, and understood very clearly that she had passed the point where this was something she could decide to stop. She had been deciding to stop for 4 years. She had been deciding to stop and then not stopping. And now she stood here with 5 photographs on her kitchen table and understood that the decision had been settled, not by any single moment, but by the accumulation of all of them, by the fact that she had already done it 4 times. 5 years of a child who was visible in this form, only here, in this house, in these photographs. If she had not been taking them, there would be nothing. She knew, with the particular certainty of someone who had spent a good deal of time in the vicinity of the Dursley household, that there were no birthday photographs at 4 Privet Drive. There were no birthday photographs because there were no birthdays, or none that involved the child currently being documented on her kitchen table. Wherever else Harry Potter existed, he existed as a fact to be managed. Here, in these 5 images, he existed as a subject. She wasn't sure, standing in the kitchen that smelled of cabbage with the July evening coming in through the open window, whether that distinction mattered to anyone but her. She suspected it mattered. She suspected that somewhere in the distance, in the version of this story she couldn't see yet, it would turn out to matter very much that she had been keeping this record. She did not know how or why. She only knew that she had 5 photographs, and a letter in a drawer, and a boy who had asked about his parents with careful neutrality, and held a cat, like something he was afraid of losing, and that all of it was hers to keep, and no one else's. She put the photographs back in the box, and the box behind the cat food tins. She put the kettle on. She listened to the evening settle around the house, and thought about Jamie Hutchins' party, and did not, for once, feel the particular loneliness of being the only person watching. Tonight, watching felt like enough. He had been carrying the question since before he arrived. She could tell because of the way he was quiet when he came in, not his usual quiet, which was habitual and almost structural. The quiet of someone who had built themselves to fit a certain amount of space, but a different quiet, the kind that meant something was being held still rather than something being absent. He said hello to Tibbles. He went into the front room. He stood at the photographs for a while without naming them. He sat down on the floor, and Mr. Pause came and put his chin on his knee, and Harry looked at the middle distance with his careful, self-contained expression, and the question was there in the room with them before he had said a word. The first real quiet of the morning, after the tea was made and the cats had settled and the ordinary small administrations of the early hour had been completed, he asked it. "Are my mum and dad in heaven?" He asked it without preamble, without leading in, without looking up from the cat directly, as though he had been saving it for a specific kind of silence and had determined that this was the one. He was 7 years old, and he had been told, at some point in the years since he was old enough to ask where his parents were, that they had died in a car crash, and he had accepted this, the way he accepted most things the world told him about itself, as a condition of the landscape, as a fact requiring no particular ceremony. He was not, Arabella realized, asking whether they had existed or how they had died, or anything that touched on the territory she was not permitted to enter. He was asking where they had gone afterward. It was such a particular question, such a carefully bounded question. He was 7, and he knew, as 7-year-olds knew things, that the answer to some questions was not going to be given to him, and he had found the smallest version of the question that had any chance of being answered. "I think so," Arabella said, because she had to say something, and because she did not know that they weren't, and because the alternative was to say nothing while a 7-year-old waited for an answer about his dead parents. He nodded. He received this. He was quiet for a moment in a way that suggested he was not done. "Did you know them?" he asked. "My mum and dad." She had known this was coming. She had known it was coming the moment he arrived with the held quality about him, and she had spent the better part of the morning preparing the answer, rehearsing its careful narrowness. "Not well," she said. "I knew who they were, but I didn't really know them." This was true. It was true in the precise particular way that things you said to protect someone from the larger truth was sometimes true. True in its facts, true in its containment, not true in what it implied. That there was no world in which she had come close to something vast and bright, and been kept on the other side of it by her own particular limitations. She watched him take it in. He looked at the cat. He adjusted, very slightly, the angle at which he was sitting. He nodded once, slowly, the way he nodded at information he was filing away because he didn't yet have anywhere better to put it. The acceptance was harder to watch than any other response would have been. If he had protested, if he had said it wasn't fair, if he had cried, if he had pushed back against the insufficient answer with any of the perfectly reasonable emotional tools that a 7-year-old had access to, she would have sat with the protest and not been destroyed by it. But he accepted. He accepted with the practiced ease of a child who had been given insufficient answers for as long as he had been asking questions, and the acceptance was so fluent and so complete that it was worse than grief would have been. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, still in the same level, factual register, "I don't have a photograph of them." He said it the way he said the dog biscuits, the year before, the way he said I wasn't invited to Jamie Hutchins's party, as a condition of the world rather than a grievance about it, as something he had noted and catalogued and placed in the part of his mind where he kept the things that were simply true. He was not saying it to move her. She doubted. He knew that he was saying it to anyone. He was saying it the way you said something, when it had been sitting in you long enough that it needed to be somewhere else for a moment. Arabella looked at her camera on the shelf. She had been doing it for, she nearly thought, 6 years, and stopped herself 5. She had 5 photographs of him, ages 2 through 6, in the box, in the kitchen cupboard, in the envelope behind the cat food tins. She had been taking his photograph every year on his birthday for 5 years, and he was sitting in her front room, telling her that he had no photograph of the people who had died for him, and she had not told him, and she was not going to tell him, and the 2 facts existed in the same room as each other, and there was nothing she could do to reconcile them except to sit with both of them and not look away. She was not allowed to tell him. She was not allowed to tell him about the photographs or about his parents or about any of the things that she knew, and he did not, because Dumbledore had decided when, and the when was not 7, and she was not going to substitute her judgment for Dumbledore's on this matter, because the arrangement was the arrangement, and the blood protection was the blood protection, and she had understood all of this when she agreed to it, and she understood it now. The camera sat on the shelf. He had no photograph of them. He had no photograph of his parents, who had been extraordinarily alive and were now extraordinarily dead, and she had 5 photographs of him, and he did not know, and none of it made any sense except in the specific, grinding, non-negotiable sense in which it all made perfect sense. She got up. She said she was going to get more tea. She went to the kitchen and stood at the counter for a moment, and then she came back. He had moved while she was out. He had drifted to the wall of photographs, which he often did when he had nothing specific to do, but he was looking at them differently. Today, he was not running his inventory, not saying the names, not completing his circuit. He was standing in front of a cluster of photographs near the window where the light was good for photography, the photographs where the cats had turned toward the camera, with the open, direct gaze of animals who were neither performing nor withholding, who simply were. He was looking at them with a concentration she recognized as different from his usual looking. He was looking at the photographs of her cats, the way you looked at something that had something you needed. She understood, watching him, what he was doing. He was looking for what it looked like to be looked at with uncomplicated affection. He was studying it. He had found it in the photographs of her cats, and he was standing there at 7 years old, learning the shape of it from animals who couldn't know they were teaching him anything. She picked up the camera. She took the photograph while he was still absorbed in the wall, still studying Tibbles, looking back through the lens with that round, interested, entirely non-conditional attention. Harry's profile and the cats' faces meeting his gaze with more warmth than they probably knew they were offering. He didn't notice the flash this year. He was too far inside whatever he was looking for to register it. That evening, she sat with the 6 photographs at the kitchen table and did not immediately put them away. 6 of them now. She had not planned to have 6. She had not planned to have one, and yet here were 6, arranged on the kitchen table in a row that began with a 2-year-old in afternoon light and ended with a 7-year-old, looking at photographs of cats for reasons she was not supposed to understand as well as she did. She sat with them in the dark of the kitchen with the cats settling around her and the July night coming in through the window, and she turned the question over and over in a way that she didn't yet have adequate language for. What was a witness worth if the witness couldn't speak? What did it mean to see something clearly, year after year, if the seeing produced no intervention, no change, no word of truth to the person being seen? She was not the answer to his question. She was not the person who could give him a photograph of his parents, or tell him who they were, or allow him to know what he was. She was the person who gave him plain biscuits in a house that smelled of cabbage, and photographed him without his knowledge, and put the photographs in a box behind the cat food tins, and went on watching. She looked at the 6 photographs for a long time. She thought about what it meant that she was the only record of this, of him being here, on these days, alive and present, and looked at. And she thought quietly and without resolution about the difference between being a witness and being useful, and whether it was possible to be one without the other, and whether it mattered. She didn't find an answer. She put the photographs back in the box. She fed the cats. She went to bed while the question was still open. It was still open in the morning. She finished the letter in December. She had been writing it in one form or another since July of 1985, and the draft in the drawer had been added to and revised, and in places taken apart and rebuilt so many times that it was less a draft than a sediment, layers of different months pressing against each other. The controlled anger of one autumn sitting on top of the more clinical observations of the previous spring. She took it out on a Tuesday evening in December, when the nights had gone fully dark by 4 o'clock and the cats were arranged for winter, and there was nothing else she could honestly tell herself needed doing first. She read it through. She added 3 things: the question he had asked in July about whether his parents were in heaven, and the quality of his face when she told him she hadn't known them well. The way he had stood at her photographs afterward looking for something in the faces of her cats. And this cost her something, and she paid it. The cup, the one that had slid across the table in the summer of 1984, when he was 4, without anyone touching it in the specific way that things moved when a child who did not yet know what they were reached unconsciously for something they needed. She had not written about the cup in the original draft because she had not been sure, in 1985, whether writing it down made it more real or simply made her more implicated in it. She was sure now. Whether they would do anything about it was a separate question that she had stopped expecting an answer to, but they needed to know she did not write about the photographs. She read the completed letter through twice and felt, each time, the place where the photographs were absent as a kind of pressure. A door she had decided not to open. The photographs were not evidence of what was being done to him. They were evidence of what she had been doing, and the 2 things were different, and she was not ready to explain the difference to anyone whose job it was to assess whether she had been doing her assignment correctly. She sealed the letter and sent it. Then she waited. The reply came 10 days later in January, which was not enough days, and also too many. It was not from Dumbledore directly, not in his hand, not over his name, but it was clearly from someone who had been authorized to speak for the position, and the position was clear. The blood protection required Harry's continued residence with his mother's family. The protective magic, which was the most powerful shield currently available to the child, depended on his remaining at 4 Privet Drive as his primary home. The order was aware that conditions there were not ideal and regretted this. Harry's safety, however, was the paramount consideration, and the headmaster had determined that the risks of disruption to the current arrangement outweighed the difficulties of maintaining it. She was to continue her assignment. She was thanked for her thorough documentation and encouraged to report any developments of significance. The letter was polite. It was thorough. It had clearly been written by someone who understood what they were asking and had decided to ask it anyway, and had taken the care to phrase the asking in language that acknowledged the weight of the thing being asked without conceding that the weight constituted a reason to stop. She read it twice at the kitchen table. The cats watched her from various locations around the room. Tibbles on the windowsill, Snowy on the chair beside her, Mr. Paws occupying the center of the kitchen floor, in the authoritative way he had, Tufty at the door to the hall, each of them attending in their separate, uncommunicative way to what was happening to her. The fury came first. She had expected it, and she let it come, let it move through her, in the efficient way that fury moved through someone who had no outlet for it. A full, bright anger at the precision of the reply, at the way it had correctly identified every counter-argument she might make. Told so in careful language that she was thanked for her thorough documentation while the things she had documented continued. After the fury came the grief. The grief was quieter and took longer. It had to do with what she had written, and what writing it had cost her, and what she had received in return, and it had to do, underneath that, with the fact that she had known. She had known before she sent the letter what the letter would produce. She had known the answer before she asked the question. She had asked anyway, and the asking had confirmed what she already knew, and confirmation was somehow worse than uncertainty, even when the uncertainty had also been terrible. And after the grief came the exhaustion, the particular bone-settling exhaustion of someone who has heard the thing they were afraid of hearing and must now decide what to do with the fact of having heard it. She sat at the kitchen table in January, with the reply in her hand, and Snowy on the chair beside her, and she was very tired, and the cats looked at her without comfort or judgment, because they were cats, and what they offered was only their presence, which was not nothing. She put the reply in the drawer. She put it in the drawer with the original draft that had become the letter that had become the reply, and she closed the drawer, and she went to the kitchen cupboard and took out the box from behind the cat food tins. She looked at the 6 photographs on the table, ages 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 6 photographs of a boy who would be 8 in July. She did not make the decision in dramatic terms. She was aware that the dramatic version of the decision would have frightened her, would have required her to look directly at what she was doing, and name it something larger than she was comfortable naming it. She did not do that. She made the decision the way she suspected most decisions of consequence were actually made, which was quietly at a kitchen table in January, without ceremony, in the presence of 4 cats who had not been consulted and were providing their support. Nonetheless, she would keep doing this. She would take his photograph every birthday for as long as he came to her door, and she would develop the photographs and put them in the envelope in the box behind the cat food tins. And she would not send them to the order, because the order had been sent a letter and had replied in careful language, "And thank you for the documentation." The photographs were not for the order. She had thought, when she began, when begin was even the right word, which it probably wasn't, since nothing that felt like a beginning had happened, only a succession of moments in which she had not stopped, that the photographs might be useful one day. That they might constitute evidence of something that the order, or the ministry, or someone with the power to act, would eventually need to see. She did not think that now the order had her letter. The order had her documentation. The order had, apparently, everything it needed from her, and had arrived at its position regardless. The photographs were not for the order. They were not for Dumbledore. They were not for the Ministry or the Wizengamot, or anyone who dealt in evidence and jurisdiction and the weighing of one form of harm against another. They were for her. And they were, in some way she couldn't fully account for him, even though he didn't know they existed, even though he might never know, even though there was a reasonable possibility that nobody but her would ever see them. Someone had to remember what he looked like year by year in the years when the remembering was the least of what he should have been given. She put the photographs back in the box. She put the box back in the cupboard. She fed the cats their dinner, which they received with the focused appreciation of cats for whom dinner was the primary event of any given evening, and she washed the bowls and put the kettle on and stood at the dark January window. The house smelled of cabbage. Outside, the street was quiet and very cold. 7 months until July. She had a great deal of waiting to do, and she had always been good at waiting. She made her tea, and she drank it, and she went to bed, and the box sat in the cupboard where she had put it, and the photograph sat in the box, and the house was quiet around all of it in the way that houses were quiet when they had been decided in. He had been in the house for perhaps 4 minutes when he started tidying. She had not asked him to. She had not asked him to in the 7 years he had been coming here, and on the previous 6 occasions the question had not arisen because he had not done it. But he was 8 now, and something had changed in him over the past year in the way that things changed in children who were being used as domestic labor before they were old enough to have a word for it. The work had become instinct. He picked up a ball of wool that Tufty had unraveled from the basket by the sofa, and rewound it neatly and set it back without breaking his stride coming through the door. He straightened the magazines on the low table beside the chair. He pushed the cat food tins on the shelf back against the wall in a line, with the labels facing out, the way someone did a thing they had done so many times it happened below the threshold of decision. He did not notice that he had done any of it. Arabella stood in the doorway from the kitchen and watched him settle onto the floor with Mr. Paws, and thought about what it meant. That occupation had become his resting state. That the absence of a task was a thing he corrected for automatically, before he could register the absence. He was 8 years old, and he had already learned, was still learning, was, perhaps, still in the middle of learning, that stillness in certain rooms was a problem to be solved rather than a state to be inhabited. She had baked biscuits the night before. Not a cake. She had considered a cake, briefly and with some practicality, and dismissed it. A cake had candles. A cake required the word birthday. A cake was the kind of thing that might be reported to the Dursleys as evidence of a pleasant morning. She had made plain biscuits, the same as always, the same tin she'd had for years, except that these she had made herself, in her own kitchen, at 9 o'clock the previous evening, which was not a thing she had done for anyone in a considerable time. She had not put icing on them, she had not decorated them in any way that could be construed as celebratory. They were plain biscuits, slightly warm when she had wrapped them in a cloth, and she had told herself that this was practical, that a growing child needed to eat, and she had the facilities to provide something better than a tin of commercial shortbread, and that was the entirety of the reasoning. She put them on the table after an hour, when the initial settling period had passed and Harry had stopped straightening things in her front room and was sitting with the cats in the easy way he had developed over years of sitting with them. "I made biscuits," she said. He came to the table and sat down and took one, and ate it with the focused, unsentimental attention he brought to food, not enjoyment exactly, or not only enjoyment, but a kind of earnest concentration, as though eating were a thing that required his full engagement in the same way that other things required it. He ate it carefully and completely, and when he was done, he looked at the plate with a look she had learned to read over the years as gratitude, stripped of any expectation that the gratitude would change anything. "Thank you," he said. He took a second one. She pushed the plate slightly closer to him and said nothing. She had been different since January. She could feel the difference in herself, not warmer, exactly, not in any way the Dursleys could observe and use as a reason to withdraw the arrangement. She had not done anything the Dursleys could point to. But in her private attentions, in the choices she made that were not visible from outside the house, in the things she did, between his arrival and his collection, she had become more deliberate. The January letter and the January reply had settled something in her, and what it had settled was the question of who she was doing this for, not the Order, not Dumbledore, for herself and for him and for the record being built in the box behind the cat food tins. And because no one else was going to, the result was biscuits she had made herself. It was a small thing. She was aware of how small it was. But it was hers, and it was his, and it had nothing to do with anyone else's instructions. After the biscuits, he drifted back to the front room, and she found herself, as she often did, orbiting around the question of how to fill the hours between now and 4 o'clock, with things that were neither too pleasant nor too obviously designed to conceal their pleasantness. She cleared the cups, she fed the cats their midday meal. She stood in the front room and looked at the shelves that Harry had straightened without being asked and found herself, for the first time in 8 years of these visits, running out of things to do before the day had run out of morning. She picked up the camera. He was at the shelves again, the bookshelf this time, straightening the cat care volumes she had never quite managed to organize into a system, and she stood in the doorway and raised the camera before she had consciously decided to. His back was mostly to her. She could see the wing of one thin shoulder, and the dark disorder of his hair, and the angle of his arms as he worked. Deliberate and economic, the way he did everything. He did not know the exact moment she took the photograph because she had been quiet about it. He was too occupied with the task to hear her. She pressed the shutter. The photograph, when she developed it, would show a child making himself useful in someone else's house. An 8-year-old straightening shelves in a room that was not his, in a house where no one had asked him to, for reasons she suspected had less to do with any desire to help her, and more to do with the fact that he had learned, somewhere in the past several years, that occupying himself was safer than waiting to be noticed. That if you were doing something, you were less likely to be a problem. That presence required justification, and justification required work. She lowered the camera. He had not turned around. The question came an hour or so later, in the quiet of the early afternoon, when the cats had subsided into their various arrangements and the house had settled into the warm, particular stillness of July. He was organizing her sewing basket, which had needed organizing for approximately 3 years and which she had been meaning to address, and he was doing it without comment, sorting the reels of thread by size with the absorption of someone who found order inherently satisfying. And then he said without looking up, "Do you get lonely?" He said it in the flat, careful tone he used for questions that had a personal stake in them. The tone of someone who had worked out that asking a question about yourself was risky, and asking the same question about someone else was almost the same and considerably safer. He was not looking at her, he was looking at the thread. Arabella stood very still for a moment. "Yes," she said. He nodded once, still looking at the thread, and continued sorting. She watched him and understood that she had been given something permission to answer. He had asked because he needed to hear whether the answer was yes, and she had given him yes. And now she had the choice of leaving it there or giving him the rest. She gave him the rest, but Less so, she said, on your visits. The words sat in the room. He did not look up. He turned over a reel of blue thread and set it in the right place, and reached for the next one, and she could not see his face, and could not read what he had done with what she had said, and she was not entirely sure she needed to. She had said it. It was true. It was the truest thing she had offered him in 8 years, and it had nothing to do with cats or cabbage or Dumbledore or the blood protection on 4 Privet Drive, and she would not take it back. She was aware, sitting in her chair in the afternoon, quiet while he finished the thread and moved on, without comment, to something else, that she had crossed a line. She was not certain it was a line she had been right to cross. She was certain only that it was a line she had crossed deliberately, with full knowledge, in the specific way that decisions made since January were now made, not because the rules permitted it, but because the rules had already shown her what they permitted. At 4 o'clock, Petunia came. He went. The house settled back into itself. That evening, she took out the box and put the 7th photograph with the others and spread them all on the table. 7, ages 2 through 8. She had a system now, or something that had become a system without her designing it, and she could see the shape of it in the row of photographs, the particular light she always photographed him in, the angle she had arrived at, without meaning to. The way he was never quite looking at the camera, because the camera was familiar and therefore not the most interesting thing in the room. 7 photographs. She sat with them for a while, not for any particular purpose, but because they needed sitting with. She was aware that she had said something today that she could not unsay. She was also aware that she did not wish to unsay it. He had been coming to this house for 8 years. And for 8 years she had been giving him the boredom and the cabbage smell and the cat photographs on the walls, because the arrangement required it. And today she had given him one true thing, but possible, that he had needed it more than he needed the biscuits. She thought about that for a long time. She thought about it while she fed the cats and washed the cups, and put the photographs back in the box and the box back in the cupboard. She thought about it, quietly and without resolution, while she made her dinner and ate it alone at the kitchen table in a house that smelled of cabbage and was full of cats and was as lonely as it ever was, except not quite. Less so on his visits. She had said it, and it was true, and now she had said it to him, and that was a different kind of true. He had been to the school library and found a book about cameras. She knew this because he told her, in the particular way he communicated things that had occupied him, not with excitement, not with the breathless urgency that other children brought to topics they were interested in, but with the measured, slightly formal delivery of someone who had found something worth examining and was now examining it in your presence. He had read about apertures and shutter speeds, and the way that light entered a lens and became, through a process he found difficult to fully visualize but intended to understand, an image on film. He had the focused, lateral curiosity of someone who had spent enough time in libraries to understand that one question led to another. "Why do you take so many photographs of your cats?" he asked. He was looking at the wall as he asked it doing his circuit, the inventory he still completed every year, though now he moved through it faster, the names long since memorized, the circuit more ritual than discovery. He paused at a photograph she had taken last autumn. Tibbles on the garden wall, the light at a particular angle she had been pleased with. "I like to remember them," she said. He looked at the photograph. He was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet, when he was thinking something through, rather than simply being still. And then he moved along the wall, and then he stopped again at a different photograph, a different angle of afternoon light. "I wish someone photographed me," he said, "when I was little." He said it with the same flat candor he brought to all the arithmetic of his life, with no self-pity, no appeal for response, no invitation to pity. It was a statement of something he had understood to be absent, noted the absence of, and filed. He did not say it as an accusation. He did not say it as a request. He said it with the specificity of someone who had been thinking about the subject of cameras and light and the way images preserved things, and had arrived, through the process of thinking about it, at a true fact about his own life that it was accurate to name. She was standing 7 feet away from him, with her camera on the shelf behind her, and 7 photographs of him in the kitchen cupboard. She said nothing. There was nothing she could say, nothing that was true and permitted, nothing that was permitted and adequate, nothing that bridged the distance between what he had just said and what she knew, because what she knew was exactly and precisely the thing she was not allowed to tell him. She had been photographing him since he was 2 years old. She had 7 photographs of him as a little child, carefully developed, stored in an envelope in a box behind the cat food tins. She had been doing this for 7 years without his knowledge, and he was standing at her wall and wishing it had been done, and she could not tell him. She picked up the camera. She moved to the far end of the room. She photographed him from across the room this year, with more space around him in the frame than she had used before. She wanted to capture, and felt the wanting of it sharply enough to act on it, how small he was against the background of her house, against the wall of photographs and the familiar furniture, and the particular dimensions of the room he had been coming to for 7 years. He was 9, and he was still small, still thin, still dressed in things that had been someone else's, and from across the room you could see how much space the room had that he was not occupying. He did not know she had taken it. He was still looking at the photograph of Tibbles on the garden wall when the shutter closed. The year moved on. July came again. She felt it differently at 10 than she had felt any of the preceding years. Felt the approach of his birthday with something she could only describe as the particular dread of someone who has been waiting a long time for something, and finds now that it is close, that waiting was better than it arriving. He was going to be 10. In a year, he would be 11. In a year, the letters would come, and Hogwarts would come, and everything that Dumbledore had been building toward for the past 9 years would begin. He would be released from 4 Privet Drive. He would enter the world he did not yet know he belonged to, and she would have no reason to see him. She had been watching him for 9 years. She had been watching him since he was 2 years old, and didn't have words yet, watching him grow into his quietness and his carefulness, and his extraordinary, devastating competence at being in rooms without demanding anything of them. She had been watching and photographing and keeping and waiting. And the waiting had always been for something, for the time when it ended, for the time when he was old enough to know, for the time when Hogwarts came, and the long arrangement finally resolved itself. She had wanted that resolution. She had needed it in the way that people needed the end of difficult things. She had not understood until now that the end of this difficult thing was also the end of this. He arrived on the 31st of July looking as he always looked, like himself, thin and dark-haired and watchful, and contained a 10-year-old in a shirt with the sleeves too long, who had the air of someone traveling through a world that had not yet decided what to do with him. He said hello to Tibbles and went to the front room and sat down. He was not a child who needed to be entertained. He was a child who had learned to furnish his own stillness. He mentioned, somewhere in the middle of the morning, that he made breakfast for the family every day. He said it the way he said things about the mechanics of his life, not with complaint, not with the expectation that it would be received as remarkable, but as information, as a fact about how mornings worked in his world. He was 10, and he knew how to cook for 4 people. Eggs, he said, and toast. Sometimes bacon. He said it with the matter-of-fact authority of someone who has been doing something long enough that they have opinions about it. She thought about what she had been doing at 10. She thought about the kinds of things that 10-year-olds were generally doing in the mornings. She made herself stop thinking about it. The afternoon came in with its particular warmth, the long gold of late July pressing through the south window, and the cats arranged themselves in it with the deliberateness of creatures who had mapped the light in this room across many years and knew exactly where to be. Harry was on the floor with Mr. Paws and Tufty, not quite doing anything in the easy, comfortable way he had developed with them over years of being in the same room, and she stood at the edge of the doorway and reached for the camera. He heard her. She was certain of it. She had made no unusual sound. She had moved as she always moved, but he heard something or felt something. The particular change in the quality of attention in the room that happened when someone raised a camera. He looked up before she had it fully raised. He looked directly at her. He did not smile. He did not arrange his face into any expression except the one he already had. He did not pose or straighten or do any of the things that people did when they knew they were being photographed. He simply looked at her, looked at the camera, and through it, with those bright green eyes that had been the same shade since the afternoon she first saw them, in the flash of her camera, when he was 3 years old and looking up from the photographs of her cats. He looked at her the way he had looked at the answer about loneliness the year before, with the patient, slightly searching quality of someone who was used to not receiving things and was not sure whether this was a moment that was different. She pressed the shutter. He looked at her for another moment afterward, still with that expression, and then looked back at Mr. Paws, and the moment closed. That evening she spread all 9 photographs on the kitchen table. She had done this with fewer of them before, in different configurations, at different stages of understanding what she was looking at. She had never had all 9 before. She put them in order and stood over them and let herself look. Ages 2 through 10, 9 years. He was taller in each one. Measurably, technically, undeniably taller. The photographs proved it. The proportions changed in ways she could trace from image to image. He was growing. He was growing in the way that things grew when the growing happened, whether anyone intended it to or not, like plants in poor soil, like children in houses where the lights went off at a certain hour, and the food was never quite enough. He was as alone at 10 as he had been at 2. She could see it in the row of photographs, the same quality in every image regardless of his age, or what his hands were doing, or where he was looking. The same contained self-sufficiency, the same careful presence, the same absolute absence of the ease that children had when they were certain of their place in a room. He had never been certain of his place in any room. 9 years. And he was still the child who had walked into her house and immediately begun taking up as little space as possible, as though space were a thing you were allowed only by permission, and the permission could be revoked. Not growth, she had thought for years, that she was documenting growth. What she had been documenting was endurance. A child enduring, year by year, with the specific particular resilience of someone who has not been given a choice about whether to endure and has therefore become extraordinarily good at it. She put the photographs in the box. She put the box in the cupboard. She stood at the kitchen window in the July dark and thought about the 9th photograph, about those green eyes looking at her through the lens, patient and searching. The question in them she had not answered. A year from now, someone else would begin to answer it, not her. Dumbledore threw Hagrid in a letter delivered on a motorbike in the manner that Dumbledore delivered things at the last possible moment and with maximum effect. A year from now, and not her, and not here, she fed the cats. She went to bed. Outside it was still summer. It was Tufty in the end. Not that it mattered which one. She had come down the stairs on the morning of the 23rd of June, carrying a laundry basket, and not quite watching her feet. And Tufty had been on the 3rd step from the bottom, for reasons that were entirely Tufty's own. And the rest had happened in the particular sequence that these things happened. One moment she was upright, and the next she was not, and the basket had gone one way, and she had gone another, and the sound her ankle made when it met the floor was the kind of sound you did not quickly forget. The doctor said it was a clean break. He said this as though cleanliness were the primary quality one wanted in a fracture, as though she should be gratified. He put it in plaster and told her to stay off it, and gave her a crutch and a list of things she should not do, and she came home to Wisteria Walk in a taxi, and sat down in her chair and looked at the 23rd of June on the calendar on the wall. Dudley Dursley's birthday. He was 11 today. She had been watching his birthday from a distance for 10 years, watching it in the sense that his birthday was the day that Harry arrived at her door, the day she made room in her routine, the day she was needed. She had not thought of Dudley's birthday as a day that mattered in itself. She had thought of it as the occasion for Harry. Today Harry had not come to her door. The Dursleys had taken him with them, presumably. They did this sometimes. On Dudley's birthday, took Harry along to wherever they were taking Dudley, brought him as a body rather than left him as a problem. She did not know where they had gone. She had not been consulted and could not have asked without revealing that she had been tracking these outings for a decade. She knew only that it was 23 June, and that her leg was broken, and that Harry was somewhere she could not see. She was, for the first time in 9 years, not watching. The cats were very present. They had the acute sensitivity of Kneazle-touched animals to changes in the household, and a person with a broken leg and a crutch, and a particular quality of misery constituted a significant change. Tibbles installed himself on the ottoman beside her elevated leg, and stayed there with the solemn attentiveness of a creature who was not going to pretend this was fine. Snowy moved between the chair and the window at intervals. Mr. Paws sat in the kitchen doorway and looked at her with the expression he reserved for situations he found structurally unsatisfactory. Tufty, who had caused the whole thing, came and went with the slightly guilty frequency of a cat who knew she had done something and was not entirely sure whether to be sorry about it. She fed them at midday by making the trip to the kitchen very slowly with the crutch, a journey that covered approximately 8 feet of floor and took longer than she would have liked to admit. She made tea while she was there. She stood at the kitchen counter with her weight on one leg and thought about Harry at the zoo, or wherever they were, wherever Dudley's birthday had been taken this year. She did not know what was happening. She did not know what he was doing, or whether he was being fed, or whether anyone had spoken to him today, or whether the day was worse than usual or merely the usual kind of not good. She had spent 9 years in the specific constrained proximity of his life, and she had known, each of those years, the broad shape of where he was and what was probably happening to him, and today she did not know, and the not knowing was a physical thing, an actual discomfort that had nothing to do with her ankle. She went to the kitchen cupboard. She told herself she was going to get the cat's afternoon biscuits from the shelf above the box. She got the cat's afternoon biscuits from the shelf above the box. Then she stood there with the biscuits in her hand and looked at the box, and then she put the biscuits on the counter and took out the box. she spread all 9 photographs on the kitchen table. She had done this in the evening before, when the day had finished, and she was summing up what had happened. She had not done it in the middle of a June afternoon, while the day was still going on without her. She set them out in order, on the table, age 2, age 3, age 4, all the way to age 10, and looked at them in the bright, flat light of early summer, coming through the kitchen window, which was a different light from the lamplight she usually looked at them in, more real in some way, less like a record and more like something that had actually happened. 9 years. 9 photographs of a boy she had been watching since he was 2 years old and didn't have words yet. She went through them one by one. The afternoon light at 2, the cats on either side of him, the flash-caught green eyes at 3, the biscuit at 4, the back of his head at 5, Tufty in his arms at 6, the searching look at 7, the tidying of her shelves at 8, the small figure at 9 against the backdrop of her room, the direct gaze at 10, looking through the lens with that patient, unanswerable question in his face. Today he was somewhere else, and something was happening, and she was in her kitchen with her broken leg and his 9 photographs and no way to know. The afternoon stretched out. She left the photographs on the table. She moved back to her chair and elevated her leg again and let the house be quiet around her, the summer quiet of a house with cats in it, and a specific absence that should not have been an absence because he was 11 and not 2, and she was not supposed to think of his not being here as an absence. She fell asleep. She fell asleep without meaning to, in the way that people fell asleep in chairs in the afternoon of days that had been difficult, gradually and then completely, the light changing around her without her noticing, the cats settling and resettling, the house doing its ordinary things while she was not present to observe them. She did not know, sleeping in her chair, that Harry Potter was standing at a glass tank in the reptile house of a zoo, speaking to a boa constrictor in a voice just above a whisper, telling it something about Brazil. She did not know that the glass in front of the tank had disappeared, had simply ceased to exist between one breath and the next, had been removed from the world by something that had nothing to do with any force she could have explained to anyone. She did not know that Dudley Dursley had fallen. She did not know the precise quality of the moment when a boy who had never been told what he was first discovered, something of what he could do, and that it had happened today, on a day when she was not watching. On a day when her leg was in plaster and her cats were arranged for a quiet afternoon and his 9 photographs were on her kitchen table in the daylight. She woke in the dark. The photographs were still spread on the table. She could not see them from where she sat, but she knew they were there, fanned out across the kitchen surface in the sequence she had laid them, waiting with the patience of photographs for someone to look at them again. The cats had resettled around her, Tibbles still on the ottoman, Snowy on the back of the chair, Tufty on the floor somewhere nearby. Her leg ached with the low, insistent persistence of things that had been injured and were beginning to remember it. The house smelled of cabbage and the particular closed warmth of a summer evening with the windows only half open. She sat in the dark for a moment and did the arithmetic. Today was the 23rd of June. Harry's birthday was the 31st of July. That was 38 days, a month and 8 days. She had not missed a birthday since she had been on Wisteria Walk, and she was not going to miss this one. The ankle was a clean break, and the doctor had said 6 to 8 weeks, and 6 weeks was the 23rd of July. And she would be upright again by July's end, even if upright was a relative term. One more, she would be upright. He would come to her door. She would take the last photograph, and then whatever came next would come. She got up carefully and made her way to the kitchen and gathered the 9 photographs from the table. She held them in her hands for a moment, the whole sequence of him. 9 years in her hands, the weight of it almost nothing in the physical sense and not nothing in any other. She slid them back into the envelope, and the envelope back into the box, and the box back behind the cat food tins. She closed the cupboard. She did not know what had happened at the zoo. She would not know until much later, and when she found out, she would sit with the knowledge for a long time, turning it over, thinking about what it meant that she had been home with a broken leg, while he had his first taste of something she had seen at 4 years old and not reported correctly. She would think about that for longer than she expected. But tonight, she did not know. Tonight she fed the cats in the dark and washed the single cup from midday, and stood at the kitchen window and looked at the street and thought, only one more. There is one more birthday coming, and then whatever comes next comes, and I will be there for it. She had always been good at waiting. The waiting was almost done. She knew the moment she saw him that something had changed. Not in his face. His face was what it had always been, careful, still, arranged into the particular neutral expression he had been developing and refining since he was 2 years old. The expression of someone who had decided that showing less was consistently safer than showing more. His face had not changed. But there was something in the way he held himself at the door. A tension across the shoulders, a quality of bracing, like a person waiting for a sound they knew was coming, but could not predict the exact timing of that was new, or new in this particular form. He was 11 today. He had been coming to her door for 10 years. "Morning, Mrs. Figg," he said, and came in. She had heard things over the past weeks in the way that she heard things. Not through any magical means, not through anything she could have reported to anyone as information, but through the particular attentiveness of someone who had been watching a house 2 streets over for 9 years. The letters had been arriving. She did not know exactly when they had started, but she knew they had been coming, and she knew Vernon Dursley was intercepting them, and she knew, because she knew what the letters were, that the interception was both futile and temporary. She knew all of this and had said nothing to Harry because there was nothing she was permitted to say. He knew something too. He did not know what the letters said. She could see that in him. The bracing was not the bracing of someone who had read a thing and was reckoning with it, but the bracing of someone who had been kept from a thing and was reckoning with the being kept from it. He knew there were letters. He knew they were addressed to him. He knew the Dursleys were doing whatever they could to prevent him from having them. He was 11 years old, and he had spent 11 years learning to carry the weight of what he was not being given, and this was one more version of that, and he was carrying it with the same practiced endurance he brought to everything. Arabella made tea. She brought out the tin of biscuits. She sat in her chair and let the cats do what the cats did, and she made the visit as ordinary as she had made every visit for 10 years. The photographs on the wall, the cabbage smell, nothing pleasant enough to be reported, nothing warm enough to risk. She made it ordinary because the cover had to hold, because it had always had to hold, because the arrangement was the arrangement, and nothing about today changed that. She hated herself for it in a way she had not felt since the first year she had found, over the decade of these visits, a kind of accommodation with the constraint. She had found the small spaces within it, the biscuits she baked herself, the moment of honesty about loneliness, the permission to let him hold the cats, and she had told herself that the spaces were enough, that bearing witness was not nothing. She had believed most of this on most days. Today, she believed none of it. Today, the accommodation felt like what it was, a series of careful small adjustments made inside a situation she had never had the power to change, offered up as evidence of her own good intentions toward a child who deserved better intentions than she had been authorized to act on. She made the visit ordinary. she watched him sit with the cats. He had settled on the floor in the front room with Mr. Tibbles in his lap. Mr. Tibbles, who was Tibbles, and was also Mr. Tibbles, the oldest of the four, the one who had been at the window the morning of Harry's very first visit 10 years ago, and had catalogued his arrival with the solemn attention of a creature who understood that some arrivals mattered. Tibbles was old now, in the way that cats got old, more deliberate, less inclined to movement, given to longer periods of stillness that were less sleep than something more like contemplation. He had come to Harry's lap with the unhurried authority of a cat, who had decided this was where he would be, and Harry had received him with both hands, with the same extraordinary gentleness he had had at 6 when Tufty had first consented to be held. Still small, still thin, the shirt he was wearing was too large at the shoulders and the wrists, the sleeves pushed up in the same habitual way she had been watching for years. His black hair was its usual magnificent disorder, and his green eyes, where they were visible above the cat he was attending to, had something in them today that she had not quite seen before, a waiting quality, a tautness behind the careful stillness, like a wire under tension. He was expecting something, or had become so accustomed to the expectation of something that it had settled into his posture permanently, the way long-held habits settled into the body. He knew something was coming. He did not know what. She knew what. "Harry," she said. He looked up. "I'd like to take a photograph of you with Mr. Tibbles." He nodded without any particular reaction. He had been sitting for her photographs for 9 years, and the camera had long since become part of the furniture of this house, expected and unremarkable, the kind of thing you accommodated the way you accommodated the cabbage smell and the cat photographs on every wall. He adjusted his hold on Mr. Tibbles very slightly, not posing, not arranging himself, but making the small, unconscious adjustments of someone who had learned what the camera needed, without ever being told. He looked slightly sideways, not at the lens, not quite away from it, at some middle point to the left of it, as though he were listening for something he had not heard yet. His face was the face she had been looking at for 10 years, the thin face with the dark brows and the scar she did not let herself look at directly, ever, for reasons she had never needed to articulate to herself. His eyes were the green she had first caught in the flash of her camera when he was 3 years old, and looking up from the photographs on her wall, Mr. Tibbles looked directly at the lens with the frank, encompassing attention that he brought to everything. She pressed the shutter, the 10th, the last. The sound of it was the same as it had always been. Click, and the moment was kept, and everything continued. At 4 o'clock, Petunia came. He stood up when he heard the bell and returned Mr. Tibbles to the floor with the same careful attention he had used, receiving him, gently, completely, without rushing the transition. He picked up the jacket he had hung on the peg by the door. He put it on. He turned. "Bye, Mrs. Figg," he said. He was not looking at her when he said it. He was looking at the door or past it, at something she couldn't see. He said it the way he said it every year, without preamble, without ceremony, in the tone of something that had been said so many times. It had become part of the vocabulary of leaving a particular place. "Goodbye, Harry," she said. The door opened. He went through it. Petunia closed it behind them without looking back. Arabella stood in the hall. The house settled around her the way it settled when he left, the particular reorganization of the air that happened when the space stopped containing him. And she waited until she was certain that enough time had passed, and then she opened the door. He was halfway down the path. She stood in the doorway and watched him go, The dark, untidy hair, the too large jacket, the thin figure moving at the same careful, unhurried pace he always moved, the pace of someone who had learned that rushing rarely improved anything. He reached the gate. He turned onto Wisteria Walk. He walked in the direction of Privet Drive. She watched him until he turned the corner. She stood in the doorway for a moment after he had gone, looking at the empty street, at the place on the pavement where his figure had been, and then she went inside and closed the door. She developed the photograph in the afternoon. She stood in the darkroom cupboard and watched it come up in the developer and held it in the stop bath, and looked at it Harry at 11, holding Mr. Tibbles, looking slightly sideways, listening for something. The green of his eyes caught even at that angle, in that light, the cat looking directly into the lens with the absolute composure of an animal who had nothing to hide from documentation. The shirt too large, the hair impossible. The scar, which she had always not quite looked at directly, visible today at this angle, in a way that she could not quite not see, a thin pale line against his forehead, the shape of lightning, the shape of the thing that had brought him here, the shape of what he was and did not yet know he was. She put the photograph in the envelope with the others. She put the box back in the cupboard. She did not take it out again. The evening came in slowly, the way July evenings came in, reluctantly, the light lasting past what felt reasonable, the sky holding on to blue past 8 o'clock, as though it had not yet been persuaded that the day was done. She fed the cats. She made something for dinner that she did not taste. She sat at the kitchen table and felt the house around her, the weight of the year and the weight of the 9 years before it. It was past 9 when she heard it. Not heard, exactly. Registered. Something changed in the texture of the evening. A quality of presence on the street that was too large for the street, too solid for a quiet Tuesday in July. In little whinging. She could not see 4 Privet Drive from here. Had never been able to see 4 Privet Drive from here, and in the dark and at this distance she could not see anything specific, but she did not need to see anything specific. She had been on Wisteria Walk for 9 years, and she knew the evenings here, knew the particular quality of their ordinariness, and what was in the air tonight was not ordinary. Something had arrived at 4 Privet Drive, something that would not be intercepted. Something that had come, not in an envelope, not through a letterbox, not in any form that Vernon Dursley had had time to prepare himself to stop. She stood at the window and looked at the dark street and thought about 10 years of silence, and about what came after 10 years of silence, and she understood, not as news, she had known it was coming, had been counting the days since June. Dumbledore had made her watch a child grow up in a cupboard, and she had watched. He had made her document the watching, and then do nothing with the documentation, and she had done that too. He had asked her to give a boy 10 years of boredom and cabbage and deliberate bleakness on his one annual visit, and she had given him that, though it had cost her something, and he had never asked what. And now, on the street, 2 streets over the world, had descended on a boy who did not know what he was after 10 years. After 10 birthdays and 10 photographs and 1 letter that had been acknowledged and filed, after a decade of the protection being worth the cost, she stood at the window for a long time. The cats came and arranged themselves around her feet, and the house smelled of cabbage, and outside the dark street was quiet again now, ordinary again, little whinging settling back into itself after the brief, impossible pressure of something too large for it. Harry was 11. Someone had come to tell him. The street had gone quiet again. She stood at the front window for a long time after the presence had passed from the evening air, looking at the ordinary dark of Wisteria Walk, the amber of the street lamps, the closed curtains of the houses across the road. Little Whinging had absorbed whatever had happened tonight and settled back into itself with the reliable incuriosity of suburban streets, and if you had walked past now, you would not have known that anything unusual had occurred 2 streets over. In a tidy, semi-detached house where a boy had been living in a cupboard, and then a small second bedroom for the past 9.5 years, she knew it was Hagrid. She did not know this in the way that she would have known it if she had seen him. She had not seen him, could not have seen him, from here, even if she had been at the window at the right moment, which she had not been. But she knew it in the way that she knew everything about the arrangement she had been part of for 9 years. Through the accumulated logic of what Dumbledore had been building toward, through the knowledge of what the letters had been and what their delivery required when ordinary postage had been definitively blocked. There was only one way those letters finally arrived. She knew who had delivered them, and she knew what the delivery meant. Harry Potter had tonight been told what he was. She did not know exactly what had been said, or how he had received it, or what his face had looked like in the moment when the 11 years of careful and deliberate not knowing came to an end. She would not know any of that. It was not hers to know. She was a squib on Wisteria Walk who had watched a window for 9 years, and what happened after the window was not part of her assignment. She took the box out from behind the cat food tins. She had never seen all 10 photographs together. She had spread 9 of them on the table in June, in the daylight with her leg in plaster and the cats keeping her company in their various unsentimental ways. She had spread 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3 of them at other times in other states of understanding what she was doing. She had never had all 10. The cats moved around her in the small, attentive way they had when something in the house demanded their witness. Tibbles settling on the chair beside her, Snowy on the windowsill, Mr. Paws taking his customary position in the kitchen doorway, Tufty at her feet. The house smelled of cabbage, and the July night came in through the window she had left open, and Arabella Figg sat down at the kitchen table and looked at 10 photographs of Harry Potter. The first one, age 2, the 31st of July, 1982. Afternoon light coming through the south window in a long stripe across the floor. He was sitting in it with Mr. Paws on one side and Tufty on the other, though she had forgotten, over the years, which cat was which at that angle, in that light, when they were both younger. He was not looking at the camera. He was looking at something to his left, or at nothing in particular with the interior, self-contained expression of a 2-year-old thinking thoughts he had not learned to share with anyone. He was thin, the light was good, and the second, age 3, 1983. Looking up from the photographs on the wall, looking up from the photographs of her cats toward the camera, caught mid-name, the green of his eyes catching the flash in the overexposed way that flash did to color. His mouth was slightly open. His hand was raised toward the wall. She had not meant to photograph him at exactly that moment, and the photograph was better than she had intended. The third, age 4, 1984. Looking at a biscuit in his hands with his complete and serious attention. The bruise had been on the other forearm, the left one. It was not visible in this photograph. She knew it had been there. She had cleaned it with a flannel, and not asked about it, and hated herself for not asking. And the photograph showed none of that, showed only a 4-year-old with a biscuit, looking at it as though it were a thing that warranted looking at carefully. The fourth, age 5, 1985, his back to the camera. This was the only photograph in which you could not see his face at all, only the untidy black hair and the thin neck and the too large collar of a shirt that was not his, and his shoulders and the angle of his arms at his sides, and the window he was standing at, looking into her garden. He had been standing there, and she had photographed his back because his back was what she had, and because his presence in the room was what she was documenting, not his expression, and his presence was in the back as much as the face. The 5th, age 6, 1986. Holding Tufty with both hands, looking at the camera with the peripheral ease of someone who has been in a room enough times to know where everything is. He was not quite looking at the lens. He had arrived at a familiarity with the camera that had nothing to do with comfort, and everything to do with repetition, the way you became accustomed to whatever was regular in a space. Tufty was looking directly into the lens, as cats always did, with the frank and slightly superior attention of an animal who saw no reason to look anywhere else. The 6th, age 7, 1987. Looking at the cat photographs on the wall, standing before the cluster near the window, looking at the ones whose subjects looked back with the most evident and uncomplicated affection. He had been standing there, and she had understood what he was doing, and she had photographed him doing it. And in the photograph you could see it, the angle of his head, the quality of his attention, the particular way he was looking for something in the faces of her cats that he did not name. The 7th, age 8, 1988. Tidying her bookshelves, his back half-turned, one shoulder visible, his arms raised to the shelf, in the absorbed and unhurried way he did tasks that had become instinct. A child making himself useful in someone else's house. An 8-year-old who had already learned that occupation was better than stillness, that presence required justification, that if you were doing something you were less likely to be a problem. The photograph showed him at work and did not show what the work meant. The 8th, age 9, 1989, small in the wide frame. She had stepped back that year, had framed him against the full breadth of the front room, and the result was a photograph that showed how much space the room contained that he was not occupying, how much wall, how many photographs on the wall, how large the furniture was relative to the narrow, careful figure standing in the middle of it. He was not looking at the camera. He did not know she had taken it. The 9th, age 10, 1990, looking directly at the camera. The waiting look, the patient, slightly searching quality she had come to know as the expression he made when he was not sure whether a moment was different from the others, whether this was the occasion when something would be given that had not been given before. He had looked at her through the lens, and she had pressed the shutter, and afterwards he had looked away. The question in his face was unanswered. She had not answered it. She had never answered it. The 10th, age 11, 1991, holding Mr. Tibbles, looking slightly sideways, not quite at the camera, not quite away from it, at some middle point, the way you looked when you were listening for something. The shirt too large, the hair impossible. The scar, thin and pale and lightning-shaped, visible at this angle in a way she had always not quite looked at directly and in the photograph could not avoid. And in his eyes, at this angle, in this light, something she had not seen in any of the 9 photographs before it. Not the waiting look, which had been in the 9th, and which was a particular kind of resignation dressed as patience. Something else. Something that had come into him today, in the days of the arriving and intercepted letters, in the knowledge that something was being kept from him, and the growing certainty that the keeping was temporary. The precursor of hope, if hope were a posture rather than a feeling. The brace of someone who had been carrying a weight for a very long time, and was beginning to suspect, not yet to know, but beginning to suspect, that the weight was about to be set down. She sat at the table with the 10 photographs, and was quiet for a long time. She had been deferring the question for 9 years, what to do with them, where they went, whose they were. She considered it now, fully, for the first time, with all 10 in front of her. She could send them to Dumbledore. She would not. He believed the protection worth the cost. These photographs were what the cost had looked like, year by year, from the only vantage point she had been given, and she did not trust what he would do with evidence of his own accounting. She could give them to Harry. She could not. He was gone from Privet Drive tonight, or going soon, going to a world that was waiting for him with a great deal to say, and she suspected that arriving at the beginning of all that with 10 years of photographs taken by his Muggle babysitter without his knowledge would be a strange and heavy thing to carry into what was supposed to be a beginning. She would not throw them away. That she knew without having to consider it. She would not throw them away. They were not evidence. They had never been evidence. She had understood that in the winter, after the order's polite and thorough reply, and she had not sent them then, and she would not send them now. They were not a record for the Order of the Phoenix. They were not documentation of anything that would move any institution to act. They were not, finally, for anyone outside this house. They were proof that she had been here, that she had seen him, that he had been real and present and thin and green-eyed and alive in this kitchen, in this front room, in this specific light, on these 10 specific days when no one else was marking the occasion. They were the birthday celebrations no one had given him, translated into the only language she had available, which was not warmth, and was not the truth, and was not action, and was not anything Dumbledore had authorized her to offer. It was only this witness, the record of someone having looked. She gathered the 10 photographs together. She slid them back into the envelope, all 10, the whole sequence of him, from 2 to 11, and she put the envelope back in the box and the box back in the kitchen cupboard behind the cat food tins. She closed the cupboard door. The cat settled. Tibbles was still on the chair beside her. Snowy had come down from the windowsill. Mr. Paws remained in the doorway. Tufty wound around her ankles, once, and then again, with the deliberate and slightly insistent care that Tufty brought to things she had decided were her business. Arabella Figg sat at her empty kitchen table in the house that smelled of cabbage and was full of photographs of animals, and was a short walk from a street where a boy had spent 10 summers being invisible, and she looked at the space on the table where the photographs had been. "Happy birthday," she said. She said it quietly, to the empty kitchen, to the cats, to the box in the cupboard, to the summer night coming in through the window. She said it to no one, and to the only person it could have been for. She said it the way you said the thing you had been meaning to say for 10 years, and had not found the right moment for, and had finally understood there was not going to be a right moment, and the only thing to do was say it into whatever room you were in, and let it be enough. The cats wound around her ankles.